Jig worming. You hear the phrase all the time. How'd you catch your fish? I caught him on a jig worm. And I use that phrase quite a bit too to talk to people about how the bite was, and I often get asked, well, what exactly is a jig worm? There's so many definitions. So I'm going to take the Reader's Digest version of a jig worm and show you some ways that I jig worm fish. So to me, what a jig worm is really by definition is a jig, a presentation that has some type of weight with some type of plastic bait, a worm on the back. You jig a worm back to the boat. So for me, a jig worm consists of a jig head. This happens just to be a little mushroom style jig head. Nothing fancy. You can get them all over the place. There's dozens of brands out there, and in terms of weight, it all depends on how deep you need to go, wind conditions. I like to get away with the lightest weight possible. If I'm taking new people out fishing, I might go a little heavier because there's so much importance with being able to feel the bait. So having the right jig head is somewhat important, but having a mushroom head, it works well. So I start with that, and then you have various options for tails and those sorts of things. The most common one is probably going to be your curly tail worm. This happens just to be a pocket phenom from Mr. Twister. It's just about a 5.5 inch bait. And this is one simple way to fish a jig worm. Just thread it on just like you would most plastics. And there you have it. That's a standard jig worm. It'll catch a lot of bass. I've caught walleyes on this. That's one way to fish a jig worm. Another way to fish a jig worm that's becoming more and more popular is to take your Kamita style bait, your soft plastic stick bait, same thing you wacky rig with, and you can thread that on in the same manner as you just did the phenom worm, and now you have more of a longer presentation. This is going to drop faster because these baits will drop in the water. They don't have neutral buoyancy. That's an option. Another one I like to do with that same bait, so let's say I'm fishing that Kamita and I'm getting tick 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 hits, and I'm feeling like some of them are bass but they're not taking the bait. I bite an inch and a half off, slide it back on, so now I got a smaller presentation. That's also a jig worm. So there's many forms of jig worm fishing. One common term that you're starting to hear that's probably becoming more and more popular is Ned rigging. And a Ned rig is pretty much what I just showed you. You bite off a piece of worm. It's a smaller profile jig worm where the intention is to kind of do nothing. Just pitch it out there where you know there's fish. Maybe they're in a negative or neutral pattern. You got a cold front come through. You can pitch a smaller presentation just to kind of force feed these fish. And if I switch to what we consider a Ned rig, I will downsize my mushroom jig head. I might even take a little more off than what I just showed you and thread that on there as what is now considered kind of a pretty small finesse presentation. So that can also be considered a jig worm. So there's 3 different options with a variety of tails you can throw on there to fish what you would consider a jig worm. Jig worm is going to be awesome bait for summertime, fall, deep weed lines. It's very versatile. You can get weedless hooks for jig worms. So that's the tip of the iceberg on a jig worm. Hopefully that makes sense, gives you a little more definition. Get out there and try it if you haven't. It catches a ton of fish for a variety of species. There you have it, the jig worm.